correctly, so anything. Oh, crap. What's with the... Huh. Oh. Ah! Okay. Right on. So then. Just, as I always do. Not always. But I'll just pick up where... Slightly before where I ended. Just because. Make it smoother. Willem stood looking at Smiley for a moment, wondering what to say. Anything you want, George? No, thanks. There is one thing. Yes? Could you get the CID off my back? They've visited me 3 times now, and of course they got nowhere locally. Could you make this an intelligence matter for the time being? Be mysterious and soothing? Yes, I should think so. I know it's difficult, Peter, because I'm not... Oh, another thing just to cheer you up. I had that comparison made between Fennon's suicide note and the anonymous letter. They were done by different people on the same machine. Different pressures and spacing, but identical typeface. So long, oh dear. Tuck into the grapes. Willem closed the door behind him. They heard his footsteps echoing crisply down the bare corridor. Mendel rolled himself a cigarette. Lord, said Smiley. Does nothing frighten you? Haven't you seen the sister here? Mendel grinned and shook his head. You can only die once, he said, putting the cigarette between his thin lips. Smiley watched him light it. He produced his lighter, took the hood off it, and rotated the wheel with his stained thumb, swiftly cupping both hands around it and nursing the flame towards the cigarette. There might have been a hurricane blowing. Well, you're the crime expert, said Smiley. How are we doing? Messy, said Mendel. Untidy. Why? Loose ends everywhere. No police work. Nothing's checked, like algebra. What's algebra got to do with it? You got to prove what can be proved first. Find the constants. Did she really go to the theatre? Was she alone? Did the neighbours hear her come back? If so, what time? Was Brennan really late Tuesdays? Did his missus go to the theatre regularly every fortnight like she did? And the 8:30 call. Can you tie that up for me? You got that call in the brain, haven't you? Yes. Of all the loose ends, that's the loosest. I brood over it, you know, and there just isn't any sense in it. I've been through his train timetable. He was a punctual man, often got to the FO before anyone else, unlocked his own cupboard. He would have caught the 8:54 and the 9:08, or at worst, the 9:14. The 8:54 got him in at 9:38. He liked to be at his office by 9:45. He couldn't possibly want to be woken up at 8:30. Perhaps he just liked bells, said Mendel, getting up. And the letters, Smiley continued. Different typists, but the same machine. Discounting the murderer, 2 people had access to that machine. Fennon and his wife. If we accept that Fennon typed the suicide note, and he certainly signed it, we must accept that it was Elsa who typed the denunciation. Why did she do that? Smiley was tired out, relieved that Mendel was going. I'll have to tidy up, find the constants. You'll need money, said Smiley, and offered him something from the wallet beside his bed. Mendel took it without ceremony and left. Smiley lay back. His head was throbbing madly, burning hot. He thought of calling the nurse, and cowardice prevented him. Gradually, the throbbing eased. He heard from outside the ringing of an ambulance bell as it turned off Prince of Wales Drive into the hospital yard. Perhaps he just liked bells, he muttered, and fell asleep. He was woken by the sound of argument in the corridor. He heard the sister's voice raised in protest. He heard footsteps and Mendel's voice, urgent in contradiction. The door opened suddenly, and someone put the light on. He blinked and sat up, glancing at his watch. It was 6:15. Mendel was talking to him, almost shouting. What was he trying to say? Something about Battersea Bridge, the river police, missing since yesterday. He was wide awake. Adam Scar was dead. 10. The Virgin's Story. Mendel drove very well, with the kind of schoolmamish pedantry that Smiley would have found comic. The Weybridge Road was packed with traffic as usual. Mendel hated motorists. Give a man a car of his own and he leaves humility and common sense behind him in the garage. He didn't care who it was. He'd seen bishops in purple doing 70 in built-up area, frightening pedestrians out of their wits. He liked Smiley's car. He liked the fussy way it had been maintained, the sensible extras, wing mirrors, and reversing light. It was a decent little car. He liked people who looked after things, who finished what they began. He liked thoroughness and precision. No skimping. Like this murderer. What had Scar said? Young mind, but cool. Cool as charity. He knew that look, and Scar had known it too. The look of complete negation that reposes in the eyes of a young killer. Not the look of a wild beast, not the grinning savagery of a maniac, but the look born of supreme efficiency, tried and proven. It was a stage beyond the experience of war. The witnessing of death in war brings a sophistication of its own, but beyond that, far beyond, is his conviction of supremacy in the heart of the professional killer. Yes, Mendel had seen it before, the one that stood apart from the gang, pale-eyed, expressionless, the one the girls went after, spoke of without smiling. Yes, he was a cool one, all right. Scar's death had frightened Mendel. He made Smiley promise not to go back to Bywater Street when he was released from the hospital. With any luck, they'd think he was dead anyway. Scar's death proved one thing, of course. The murderer was still in England, still anxious to tidy up. When I get up, Smiley had said last night, we must get him out of his hole again. Put out bits of cheese. Mendel knew who the cheese would be. Smiley. Of course, if they were right about the motive, there would be other cheeses too. Fennon's wife. In fact, Mendel thought grimly, it doesn't say much for her that she hasn't been murdered. He felt ashamed of himself and turned his mind to other things. Such a Smiley again. Odd little beggar Smiley was. Reminded Mendel of a fat boy he'd played football with at school. Couldn't run, couldn't kick, blind as a bat, but played like hell, never satisfied till he'd got himself torn to bits. Used to box, too. Came in wide open, swinging his arms about. Got himself half killed before the referee stopped it. Clever bloke, too. Mendel stopped at a roadside cafe for a cup of tea and a bun, and drove into Weybridge. The Repertory Theatre was in a one-way street leading off the high street where parking was impossible. Finally, he left the car in the railway station and walked back into the town. The front doors of the theatre were locked. Mendel walked round to the side of the building under a brick archway. A green door was propped open. It had push bars on the inside and the words "Stage Door" scribbled in chalk. There was no bell. A faint smell of coffee issued from the dark green corridor within. Mendel stepped through the doorway and walked down the corridor, at the end of which he found a stone staircase with a metal handrail leading upwards to another green door. The smell of coffee was stronger, and he heard the sound of voices. Oh, rot, darling, frankly. If the culture vultures of blissful Surrey want Barry 3 months running, let them have it, say I. It's either Barry or a cuckoo in the nest for the 3rd year running, and for me, Barry gets it by a short head. This from a middle-aged female voice. A querulous male replied, "Well, Ludo, you can always do Peter Pan, can't you, Ludo?" "Bitchy, bitchy," said a third voice, also male, and Mendel opened the door. He was standing in the wings of the stage. On his left was a piece of thick cardboard with about a dozen switches mounted on a wooden panel. An absurd rococo chair and gilt and embroidery stood beneath it for the prompter and factotum. In the middle of the stage, 2 men and a woman sat on barrels, smoking and drinking coffee. The decor represented the deck of a ship. A mast with rigging and rope ladders occupied the center of the stage, and a large cardboard cannon pointed disconsolately towards a black cloth of sea and sky. The conversation stopped abruptly as Mendel appeared on the stage. Someone murmured, "Oh my dear, the ghost at the feast," and they all looked at him and giggled. The woman spoke first. "Are you looking for someone, dear?" "Sorry to butt in. Want to talk about becoming a subscriber to the theatre? Join the club." "Why, yes, of course. How nice," she said, getting up and walking over to him. "How very nice." She took his left hand in both of her own and squeezed it, stepping back at the same time and extending her arms to their full length. It was a chatelaine gesture. Lady Macbeth receives Duncan. She put her head on one side and smiled girlishly, retaining his hand, and led him across the stage to the opposite wing. A door led into a tiny office littered with old programs and posters, grease paint, false hair, and tawdry pieces of nautical costume. Have you seen a panto this year? Treasure Island. It's a gratifying success, and so much more social content, don't you think, than those vulgar nursery tales?" Mendel said, "Yes, wasn't it?" without the least idea what she was talking about, when his eye caught a pile of bills rather neatly assembled and held together by a bulldog clip. The top one was made out to Mrs. Ludo Auriel, and was 4 months overdue. She was looking at him shrewdly through her glasses. She was small and dark, with lines on her neck and a great deal of makeup. The lines under her eyes had been levelled off with grease paint, but the effect had not lasted. She was wearing slacks and a chunky pullover, liberally splashed with distemper. She smoked incessantly. Her mouth was very long, and she held a cigarette in the middle of it in a direct line beneath her nose. Her lips formed an exaggerated convex curve, distorting the lower half of her face and giving her an ill-tempered and impatient look. Mendel thought she would probably be difficult and clever. It was a relief to think she couldn't pay her bills. "You do want to join the club, don't you?" "No." She suddenly flew into a rage. "If you're not a bloody tradesman, you can get out. I said I'd pay, and I will. Just don't pester me. If you let people think I'm finished, I will be, and you'll be the losers, not me." "I'm not a creditor, Mrs. Auriel. I come to offer you money." She was waiting. "I'm a divorce agent, rich client. I'd like to ask you a few questions. We're prepared to pay for your time." "Christ," she said with relief. "Why didn't you say so in the first place?" They both laughed. Mendel put £5 on the top of the bills, counting them down. "Now," said Mendel, "how do you keep your club subscription list? What are the benefits of your joining?" "Well, we have watery coffee on stage every morning at 11 sharp. Members of the club can mix with the cast during the break between rehearsals from 11 to 11:45. They pay for whatever they have, of course, but entry is strictly limited to club members." "Quite. That's probably the part that interests you. We seem to get nothing but pansies and nymphos in the morning." "Maybe. What else goes on?" "We put on a different show each fortnight. Members can reserve seats for a particular day of each run, the second Wednesday of each run, and so on. We always begin a run on the first and third Mondays of the month. The show begins at 7:30, and we hold the club reservation till 7:20. The girl at the box office has the seating plan and strikes off each seat as it's sold. Club reservations are marked in red and aren't sold off till last." "I see. So if one of your members doesn't take his usual seat, he'll be marked off on the seating plan. Only if it's sold. Of course. We're not often full after the first week. We're trying to do a show a week, you see. But it's not easy to get the facilities. There isn't the support for 2-week runs, really. No, quite. Do you keep old seating plans? Sometimes, for the accounts. How about Tuesday, the 3rd of January? She opened a cupboard and took out a sheaf of printed seating plans. This is the second fortnight of pantomime, of course. Tradition. Quiet, said Mendel. Now, who is it you're so interested in? Asked Mrs. Oriel, picking up a ledger from the desk. Small blonde party, aged about 42 or 3. Name of Fennon, Elsa Fennon. Mrs. Oriel opened her ledger. Mendel quite shamelessly looked over her shoulder. The names of club members were entered neatly in the left-hand column. A red tick on the extreme left of the page indicated that the member had paid a subscription. On the right-hand side of the page were notes of standing reservations made for the year. There were about 80 members. Name doesn't ring a bell. Where does she sit? No idea. Oh, yes. Oh, here we are. Merridale Lane, Wollaston. Merridale, I ask you. Let's look. A restore at the end of a row. Very odd choice, don't you think? Seat number R2. Oh, but God knows whether she took it on the 3rd of January. I shouldn't think we got the plan anymore, though I'd never thrown anything away in my life. Things just evaporate, don't they? She looked at him out of the corner of her eye, wondering whether she'd earned her £5. Tell you what, we'll ask the Virgin. She got up and walked to the door. Fennon, she said. Have a sec. That does ring a bell. Oh, I wonder why. Well, I'll be damned, of course. The music case. She opened the door. Where's the Virgin? She said, talking to someone on the stage. God knows. Helpful pig, said Mrs. Oriel, and closed the door again. She turned to Mendel. The Virgins are White Hope. English Rose, local solicitor's stage struck daughter, all Lyle stockings, and get me if you can. We loathe her. She gets a part occasionally because her father pays tuition fees. She does sitting in the evening sometimes when there's a rush. She and Mrs. Torr, the cleaner, who does cloaks. When things are quiet, Mrs. Torr does the whole thing, and Virgin mopes about in the wings, hoping the female lead will drop dead. She paused. I'm damn sure I remember Fennon. Damn sure I do. I wonder where that cow is. She disappeared for a couple of minutes and returned with a tall and rather pretty girl with fuzzy blonde hair and pink cheeks. Good at tennis and swimming. This is Elizabeth Pigeon. She may be able to help. Darling, we want to find out a Mrs. Fennon, a club member. Did you tell me something about her? Oh, yes. Ludo. She must have thought she sounded sweet. She smiled vapidly at Mendel, put her head on one side and twined her fingers together. Mendel jerked his head towards her. Do you know her? Asked Mrs. Oriel. Oh, yes, Ludo. She's madly musical, at least I think she must be, because she's always bringing her music. She's madly thin and odd. She's foreign, isn't she, Ludo? Why odd? Asked Mendel. Oh, well, last time she came, she got in a frightful pet about the next seat next to her. It was a club reservation, you see, and simply hours after 20 past. We just started the panto season, and there were millions of people wanting seats, so I let it go. She kept on saying she was sure the person would come because he always did. Did he? Asked Mendel. No, I let the seat go. She must have been in an awful pet because she left after the second act and forgot to collect her music case. This person she was sure to turn up, said Mendel. Is he friendly with Mrs. Fennon? Ludo Oriel gave Mendel a suggestive wink. Oh, gosh, I should think so. He's her husband, isn't he? Mendel looked at her for a moment, and then smiled. Couldn't we find a chair for Elizabeth? He said. Gosh, thanks, said the Virgin, and sat on the edge of an old gilt chair like the prompter's chair in the wings. She put her red, fat hands on her knees and leaned forward, smiling all the time, thrilled to be the centre of so much interest. Mrs. Oriel looked at her venomously. What makes you think he was her husband, Elizabeth? There was an edge to his voice which had not been there before. Well, I know they arise separately, but I thought that was because they had seats apart from the rest of the club reservations. They must be husband and wife, and of course he always brings the music case too. I see. What else can you remember about the evening, Elizabeth? Oh, well, lots really, because you see, I felt awful about her leaving in such a pet, and then later that night she rang up. Mrs. Fenton did, I mean. She said her name, and she said she left early and forgot her music case. She lost a ticket for it, too, and was in a frightful state. It sounded as if she was crying. I heard someone's voice in the background, and then she said someone would drop in and get it if that would be all right without the ticket. I said of course, and half an hour later the man came. He's rather super, tall and fair. I see, said Mendel. Thank you very much, Elizabeth. You've been very helpful. Gosh, that's okay. She got up. Incidentally, said Mendel, this man who collected a music case, he wasn't by any chance the same man who sits beside her in the theatre, was he? Rather. Oh gosh, sorry, I should have said that. Did you talk to him? Well, just to say, here you are, sort of thing. What kind of voice had he? Oh, foreign, like Mrs. Fennon's. She is foreign, isn't she? That's what I put it down to, all the fuss and state, foreign temperament. She smiled at Mendel, waited a moment, then walked out like Alice. Cow, said Mrs. Oriel, looking at the closed door. Her eyes turned to Mendel. Well, I hope you've got your 5 quid's worth. I think so, said Mendel. 11. The Unrespectable Club. Mendel found Smiley sitting in an armchair, fully dressed. Peter Grillen was stretched luxuriously on the bed, a pale green folder held casually in his hand. Outside, the sky was black and menacing. Enter the third murderer, said Grillen, as Mendel walked in. Mendel sat down at the end of the bed and nodded happily to Smiley, who looked pale and depressed. Congratulations. Nice to see you on your feet. Thank you. I'm afraid if you did see me on my feet, you wouldn't congratulate me. I feel as weak as a kitten. Why are they letting you go? I don't know when they expect me to go. Haven't you asked? No? Well, you better. I got news for you. I don't know what it means, but it means something. Well, well, said Gwillem. Everyone's got news for everyone else. Isn't that exciting? George has been looking at my family snaps. He raised the green folder a fraction of an inch and recognizes all his old chumps. Mendel felt baffled and rather left out of things. Smiley intervened. I'll tell you all about it over dinner tomorrow evening. I'm getting out of here in the morning, whatever they say. I think we found the murderer and a lot more besides. Now, let's have your news. There was no triumph in his eyes, only anxiety. Membership of the club to which Smiley belonged is not quoted among the respectable acquisitions of those who adorn the pages of Who's Who. It was formed by a young renegade of the junior Carlton named Steed Asprey, who had been warned off by the secretary for blaspheming them within the hearing of a South African bishop. He persuaded his former Oxford landlady to leave her quiet house in Holywell and take over 2 rooms and a cellar in Manchester Square, which a moneyed relative put at his disposal. It had once had 40 members who each paid 50 guineas a year. There were 31 left. There were no women, and no rules, no secretary, and no bishops. You could take sandwiches and buy a bottle of beer. You could take sandwiches and buy nothing at all. As long as you were reasonably sober and minded your own business, no one gave 2 pence what you wore, did, or said, or whom you brought with you. Mrs. Sturgeon no longer devilled at the bar, or brought to you your chop in front of the fire in the cellar, but presided in genial comfort over the ministrations of 2 retired sergeants of a small border regiment. Naturally, though, enough, most of the members were approximate contemporaries of Smiley at Oxford. It had always been agreed that the club was to serve one generation only, that it would grow old and die with its members. The war had taken its toll of CFTDiii and the others, but no one had ever suggested they could elect new members. Besides, the premises were now their own. Mrs. Sturgeon's future had taken care of, and this club was solvent. It was a Saturday evening, and only half a dozen people were there. Smiley had ordered their meal, and a table was set for them in the cellar, where a bright coal fire burned in a brick hearth. They were alone. There was sirloin and claret. Outside, the rain fell continuously. For all three of them, the world seemed an untroubled and decent place that night, despite the strange business that brought them together. "To make sense of what I have to tell you," began Smiley at last, addressing himself principally to Mendel, "I shall have to talk at length about myself. I am an intelligence officer by trade, as you know. I have been in the service since the flood, long before we were mixed up in power politics with Whitehall. In those days we were understaffed and underpaid. After the usual training and probation in South America and Central Europe, I took a job lecturing at a German university, talent spotting for young Germans with the agent potential." He paused, smiled at Mendel, and said, "Forgive the jargon." Mendel nodded solemnly, and Smiley went on. He knew he was being pompous, and didn't know how to prevent himself. "It was shortly before the last war, a terrible time in Germany then, intolerance run mad. I would have been a lunatic to approach anyone myself. My only chance was to be as nondescript as I could, politically and socially colourless, and to put forward candidates for recruitment by someone else. I tried to bring some back to England for short periods on student tours. I made a point of having no contact at all with the department when I came over, because we hadn't any idea in those days of the efficiency of German counterintelligence. I never knew who was approached, and of course it was much better that way. In case I was blown, I mean. My story really begins in 1938. I was alone in my rooms one summer evening. It had been a beautiful day, warm and peaceful. Fascism might never have been heard of. I was working in my shirt sleeves at a desk by my window, not working very hard because it was such a wonderful evening. He paused, embarrassed for some reason, and fussed a little with the port. 2 pink spots appeared high on his cheeks. He felt slightly drunk, though he had very little wine. "To resume," he said, and felt an ass. "I'm sorry, I feel a little inarticulate. Anyway, as I sat there was a knock on the door, and a young student came in. He was 19. In fact, but he looked younger. His name was CFTDiii. He was a pupil of mine, an intelligent boy, and remarkable to look at." Smiley paused again, staring before him. Perhaps it was his illness, his weakness, which brought the memory so vividly before him. CFTDiii was a very handsome boy with a high forehead and lots of unruly black hair. The lower part of his body was deformed, and I think by infantile paralysis. He carried a stick and leaned heavily upon it when he walked. Naturally, he cut a rather romantic figure at a small university. They thought him Byronic, and so on. In fact, I could never find him romantic myself. The Germans have a passion for discovering young genius, you know. From Herder to Stefan, George, somebody lionized them practically from the cradle. But you couldn't lionize CFTDiii. Oh, it's a Dieter. There was a fierce independence, a ruthlessness about him which scared off the most determined patron. This defensiveness in Dieter derived not only from his deformity, but his race, which was Jewish. How on earth he kept his place at university, I could never understand. It was possible that they didn't know he was a Jew. His beauty might have been southern, I suppose. Italian, but I don't really see how. To me, he was obviously Jewish. Dieter was a socialist. He made no secret of his views even in those days. I once considered him for recruitment, but it seemed futile to take on anyone who was so obviously earmarked for concentration camp. Besides, he was too volatile, too swift to react, too brightly painted, too vain. He held all the societies at the university, debating, political, poetry, and so on. In all the athletic guilds, he held honorary positions. He had the nerve not to drink in a university where you proved your manhood by being drunk most of your first year. That was Dieter, then. A tall, handsome, commanding cripple, the idol of his generation. A Jew. And that was the man who came to see me that hot summer evening. I sat him down and offered him a drink, which he refused. I had him eat some coffee, I think, on a gas ring. We spoke in a desultory way about my last lecture on Keats. I had complained about the complication of German critical methods to English poetry, and this had led to some discussion, as usual, on the Nazi interpretation of decadence in art. Dieter dragged it all up again and became more and more outspoken in his condemnation of modern Germany, and finally of Nazism itself. Naturally, I was guarded. I think I was less of a fool in those days than I am now. In the end, he asked me to point blank what I thought of the Nazis. I replied rather pointedly that I was disinclined to criticize my hosts, and that anyway, I didn't think politics were much fun. I shall never forget his reply. He was furious, struggled off to his feet and shouted at me, "Von Freude ist nicht die Rede! We're not talking about fun!" Smiley broke off and looked across the table to Gwillem. "I'm sorry, Peter, I'm being rather long-winded." "Nonsense, old dear. You tell the story in your own way." Mendel grunted his approval. He was sitting rather stiffly with both hands on the table before him. There was no light in the room now except the bright glow of the fire, which threw tall shadows in the rough-cast wall behind them. The port decanter was 3 parts empty. Smiley gave himself a little and passed it on. He raved at me. He simply did not understand how I could apply an independent standard of criticism to art and remain so insensitive to politics. How I could bleat about artistic freedom when a third of Europe was in chains. Did it mean nothing to me that contemporary civilization was being bled to death? What was so sacred about the 18th century that I could throw the 20th away? He had come to me because he enjoyed my seminars and thought me an enlightened man. But now he realized that I was worse than all of them. I let him go. What else could I do? On paper, he was a suspect anyway, a rebellious Jew with a university place, still mysteriously free. But I watched him. The term was nearly over, and a long vacation soon to begin. In the closing debate of the third of the term 3 days later, he was dreadfully outspoken. He really frightened people, you know, and they grew silent and apprehensive. The end of the term came, and Dieter departed without a word of farewell to me. I never expected to see him again. It was about 6 months before I did. I'd been visiting friends near Dresden, Dieter's hometown, and I arrived half an hour early at the station. Rather than hang around on the platform, I decided to go for a stroll. A couple of 100 meters from the station was a tall, rather grim 17th century house. There was a small courtyard in front of it with tall iron railings and a wrought iron gate. It had apparently been converted into a temporary prison. A group of shaven prisoners, women and men, were both being exercised in the yard, walking around the perimeter. 2 guards stood at the center with Tommy guns. As I watched, I caught sight of a familiar figure. taller than the rest, limping, struggling to keep up with them. It was Dieter. They had taken his stick away. When I thought about it afterwards, of course, I realized that the Gestapo could scarcely arrest the most popular member of the university while he was still up. I forgot about my train, went back into town and looked for his parents and telephone book. I knew his father had been a doctor, so it wasn't difficult. I went to the address, and only his mother was there. The father had died already in a concentration camp. She wasn't inclined to talk about Dieter, but it appeared that he had not gone to a Jewish prison, but to a general one, and ostensibly for a period of correction only. She expected him back in about 3 months. I left him a message to say I still had some books of his and would be pleased to return them if he would call on me. I'm afraid the events in 1939 must have got the better of me, because I don't remember I gave Dieter another thought that year. Soon after I returned from Dresden, my department ordered me back to England. I packed and left within 48 hours to find London in a turmoil. I was given a new assignment which required intensive preparation, briefing and training. I was to go back to Europe at once and activate almost untried agents in Germany who had been recruited against such an emergency. I began to memorize the dozen odd names and addresses. You can imagine my reaction when I discovered Dieter Frey among them. When I read his file, I found he had more or less recruited himself by bursting in on the consulate in Dresden and demanding to know why no one lifted a finger to stop the persecution of the Jews. Smiley paused and laughed to himself. Dieter was a great one for getting people to do things. He glanced quickly at Mendel and Gwilym. Both had their eyes fixed on him. I suppose my first reaction was pique. The boy had been right under my nose, and I hadn't considered him suitable. What was some ass in Dresden up to? And then I was alarmed to have this firebrand on my hands, whose impulsive temperament could cost me and others our lives. Despite the slight changes in my appearance and the new cover under which I was operating, I should obviously have to declare myself to Dieter as a plain old George Smiley from the university, so he could blow me sky high. It seemed a most unfortunate beginning, and I was half resolved to get set up my network without Dieter. In the event I was wrong, he was a magnificent agent. He didn't curb his flamboyance, but used it skillfully as a kind of double bluff. His deformity kept him out of the services, and he found himself a clerical job on the railways. In no time he worked his way to a position of real responsibility, and the quantity of information he obtained was fantastic. Details of troop and ammunition transports, the destination and date of transit. Later, he reported on the effectiveness of our bombing, pinpointed key targets. He was a brilliant organizer, and I think that was what saved him. He did a wonderful job on the railways, made himself indispensable, worked all hours of the night and day, became almost inviolate. They even gave him a civilian decoration for exceptional merit, and I suppose the Gestapo conveniently lost his file. Dieter had a theory that was pure Faust. Thought alone was valueless. You must act for thought to become effective. He used to say that the greatest mistake man ever made was to distinguish between the mind and the body, and order does not exist if it is not obeyed. He used to quote Kleist a great deal. If all eyes were made of green glass, and if all that seems white was really green, who would be the wiser? Something like that. As I say, Dieter was a magnificent agent. He even went so far as to arrange for certain freights to be transported on good flying nights for the convenience of our bombers. He had tricks all his own, a natural genius for the nuts and bolts of espionage. It seemed absurd to suppose it could last, but the effect of our bombing was often so widespread that it would have been childish to attribute it to one's betrayal, let alone a man so notoriously outspoken as Dieter. Where he was concerned, my job was easy. Dieter put in a lot of travelling as it was. He had a special pass to get him around. Communication was child's play by comparison with some agents. Occasionally, we would actually meet and talk in a cafe, or he would pick me up at the ministry car and drive me 60 or 70 miles along a main road as if he were giving me a lift. But more often, we would take a journey in the same train and swap briefcases in the corridor to go to the theatre with parcels and exchange cloakroom tickets. He seldom gave me actual reports, but just carbon copies of transit orders. He got his secretary to do a lot. He made her keep a special float, which he destroyed every 3 months by emptying it into his briefcase in the lunch hour. Well, in 1943, I was recalled. My trade cover was rather thin by then, I think, and I was getting a bit shop-spoiled. He stopped and took a cigarette from Gwillim's case. But let's get Dieter out of perspective, he said. He was my best agent, but he wasn't my only one. I had a lot of headaches of my own. Running him was a picnic by comparison with some. When the war was over, I tried to find out from my successor what had become of Dieter and the rest of them. Some were resettled in Australia and Canada. Some just drifted away to what was left of their hometowns. Dieter hesitated, I gather. The Russians were in Dresden, of course, and he may have doubts. In the end, he went. He had to, really, because of his mother. He hated the Americans anyway. And of course, he was a socialist. I heard later that he had made his career there. The administrative experience he had picked up during the war got him some government job in the New Republic. I suppose his reputation as a rebel and the suffering of his family cleared the way for him. He must have done pretty well for himself. Why? Asked Mendel. He was over here until a month ago, running the steel mission. That's not all, said Gwillim quickly. In case you think your cup is full, Mendel, I spared you another visit to Weybridge this morning and called on Elizabeth Pigeon. It was George's idea. He turned to Smiley. She's a sort of Moby Dick, isn't she? Big white man-eating whale. Well, said Mendel, I showed her a picture of that young diplomat by the name of Munt, and I kept in tow there to pick up the bit. Elizabeth recognized him at once as the nice man who collected Elsa Fennin's music case. Isn't that jolly? But I know what you're going to ask, you clever youth. You want to know whether George recognized him too. Well, George did. It's the same nasty fellow who tried to lure him into his house in Bywater Street. Doesn't he get around? Mendel drove to Mitcham. Smiley was dead tired. It was raining again and cold. Smiley hugged his great coat round him, and despite his tiredness, watched with quiet pleasure the busy London night go by. He'd always loved travelling. Even now, if he had had the choice, he would cross France by train rather than fly. He could still respond to the magic noises of a night's journey across Europe, the oddly cacophonous chimes and the French voices suddenly waking him from the English dreams. Anne loved it too, and had twice travelled overland to share the dubious joys of that uncomfortable journey. When they got back, Smiley went straight to bed while Mendel made some tea. They drank it in Smiley's bedroom. What do we do now? Asked Mendel. I thought I might go to Wollaston tomorrow. You'll just spend the day in bed. What do you want to go do there? See Elsa Fennin. Not safe on your own. Better let me come. I'll sit in the car while you do the talking. She's a yid, isn't she? Smiley nodded. My dad was a yid. He never made such a bloody fuss about it.